Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to a very late episode of my preparation videos for Kauwhau for this coming Sunday, the 25th of June, and then for the following Sunday. And the reason I'm doing the two together is that I didn't get around to doing it early enough to do something for this Sunday last week, and I just want to focus on the whole of chapter 6 and how we might engage in preaching this. You'll notice that chapter 6 is actually quite well connected. It's very structured and flows on. And our lection split it into two parts. So for this coming Sunday, for the 25th of June, it's up to verse 11 of chapter 6 of Romans, and then the rest of the chapter in the following one. And so I'm just going to pick out a couple of things from this coming Sunday, which I think are really significant for our preaching. And then for the second Sunday, for the first Sunday, in July, for some things from verse 12 onwards. So if we look at verses 1 through 11, it fairly naturally breaks into two parts here. The first one is in verses 1 through 4, but the really critical question that keeps getting addressed here is, Paul's been saying we've got this wonderful thing, sin has been dealt with, its penalty and its power has been defeated, and we've been liberated, and this is amazing. And then he comes to address the fairly straightforward question of doesn't that mean that I can just do what I want and get away with it? And he's trying to explain here why Christians still feel it's important that we make sure that how we live changes. So in other words, this is Paul pushing back on a fairly common assumption, and one that perhaps some of us might be tempted towards, which is like, hey, I've got my ticket, and therefore what I do doesn't matter anymore. And Paul's trying to explain why it does matter. And the first point that he makes is because our baptism has actually done something. Now, here's one point of preaching I just want you to think about here. Paul doesn't say it's your faith or your profession of your faith that has changed things here. He says that the reality of you being united with Christ in his death, so that Christ's death has an effect on you as a person, and the reality of his resurrection, of Christ's resurrection, so that it has an effect on you as a person, that this happens through your baptism. I wonder if you can see that there in verse 3. Have you forgotten that when we were joined with Christ Jesus, we joined him in his death, for we died and were buried with Christ by baptism. And just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glorious power of the Father, now we also may live new lives. And so Paul is saying here that baptism is effectual. So this is language that got picked up by that was particularly made significant by Calvin and had a huge impact on Anglican theology, and in particular around the two sacraments. So if I was preaching on this at Te Karaiti, I would point to the Māori waka that's up there, and at the very, very front of the waka, there's a kōtuku, a heron, to symbolize the sacrament of baptism. That's because manu are often used for the work of the Spirit in church symbolism. A kōtuku is, instead of a dove, which you'd get in more Western contexts, the kōtuku is there to represent the Spirit, and the Spirit's work is associated with baptism because, of course, Jesus' own baptism, the Spirit descends like a dove. So it's just a contextualization of that. And so we could point to the symbols, the visible symbols in our churches that retain this. At Holy Sepulchre, for example, there's a different setup. The font, the baptismal font, is near the entrance to the church. And this symbolizes that baptism is the doorway through which you get into the church. You join God's people, you're joined with Christ by baptism. So these symbols are probably scattered all around, and you can pick up on them in whichever church you happen to be. But the critical thing is that Christians, ever since Paul wrote this, and presumably before, have recognized that God does something in baptism. It's not merely, in fact, it's very much not at the heart of it as my profession. Instead, it's us in obedience to Christ, obedience to God's command. We are participating in something that God has said will have an effect. So Calvin's language for both baptism and the Lord's Supper is that they are effectual signs. In other words, they're symbolic. There's no material change in a person when they're baptized. They don't change from being a human to being an alien or an angel. And similarly in the Lord's Supper, nothing actually happens to the bread and wine. They're still bread and wine, but they're signs. They're not. There's nothing. Nothing has actually changed, but they have an effect, and the effect is a spiritual one. And so they're signs because the material world hasn't altered, but they're effectual because they do have a spiritual effect. Now, we have to be careful to distinguish this from magic, where we can invoke power. This isn't us making something happen. This is God saying, it's basically God fulfilling his promise. He said, I will act through baptism to unite you with Christ in his death and to life in his resurrection. And through the Lord's Supper, similarly, though Paul doesn't touch on it in chapter 6. So they're effectual signs because they're promises God has made about how he will relate to us spiritually in the world. And therefore, when we are obedient, then God keeps his promise that he's made to humanity. Now, this is the critical thing here. There's a link between, you see, baptism and obedience because, of course, baptism does require human obedience. We have to come to baptism ourselves or bring our children to baptism. These are things that we have to do. There's an act of obedience that's part of the effectual sign. You can't receive communion unless you're actually at church and you're there to receive it. You can't be baptized by remote control. These things really matter because there is an act of obedience that is coupled with God's promise to act. So all of the effect comes from God. But these things can never happen unless we're obedient. And this also links in then with where Paul goes on to in verse 5 onwards. He's saying that God's also made these other promises and they do call on us to be obedient to them. In other words, I haven't won my place in God's kingdom by my efforts. There's been won for me by Jesus Christ. But it does place a call, an obligation on me to act in response to a gift. Now, when you're preaching about this, you might think about some cultural settings in which somebody giving you a gift may well place an obligation on you then to behave in a particular way or to respond, perhaps not with the same gift, certainly not to return the gift. That would be insulting. But that it would be equally insulting to ignore the fact that you've been given a gift and to behave as if the gift had never been given. In fact, that would be a way to give deliberate insult to the person who's given you that gift. So this is the symbolism here that we've been given a gift in baptism. Baptism is the way in which we get into Christ's kingdom. We mark that out often by having our churches set up in a way that makes that visible. And there's also something here with baptism, which means that the power of sin has been broken. And Paul uses a couple of images here. One is around power. So sin has a power over us. We've been freed from it. Another one is not so much power. It's about our relational connection. So he uses the idea of being enslaved. And again, we might look to cultural settings around having been enslaved or having been set free from slavery. Interestingly, he then uses the imagery of being slaves to righteousness instead of slaves to sin. So there's this, and he also, of course, uses the language of death and life, which takes it back to baptism. So there's a rich imagery in there. My suggestion when you preach is you pick up on that imagery. Who is your allegiance to? Who's your rangatira? Who's your araki? You have to have one. And the question is it going to be sin or is it going to be Christ? Death and life. We've been brought from death to life. There are numerous ways of thinking about that culturally. And then there's also the imagery there of being enslaved and having been set free, and the idea that you're set free. Again, nobody is truly free as a human being. They're definitely serving something. And so who will you serve? Will you serve sin or will you serve life? So that's this coming Sunday, the 25th. And then on the 2nd of July, I think it is, you've got the second reading from Romans chapter 6, verse 12 onwards. And this is getting perhaps a little bit more then into the practicalities of it. And here it's particularly reminding us that we are embodied creatures. And our task is that, our task here is to recognize that our bodies matter to God. Do not let sin control the way you live. Do not let any part of your body become an instrument of evil to serve sin. So the picture here is still using the same metaphors around serving somebody, of slavery, of death and life and so forth, and of mastery or service. being enslaved or not, or to whom are you a slave. This is then picked up to say that what we do with our bodies matter. So it's become almost, sometimes we think so much about the heart that we don't think about what we're doing with our bodies. And Paul is trying to emphasize here, and he'll get onto the specifics, but he wants to emphasize that what we do with our bodies matters to God. We are embodied creatures as human beings. We're not somehow spiritually only, somehow spiritual only, and that we are now called on to make sure that the different bits of our bodies that we use are used the right way. Paul specifically mentions impurity. Of course, it's almost obvious to us that as soon as he starts talking about what you do with your bodies, one of the ways in which people frequently disobey God with their bodies is around matters of human sexuality. So in other words, to have a sexual relationship outside of marriage. Or later on, he's going to talk about the food that we eat and drink. These are the basic things of human life. And Paul is saying even these mundane things matter very deeply to God. And that these things are the way of being able to tell whether you're one of the people who has been baptized. So in other words, baptism happens, certainly in our day and age, it happens basically in the church, and it happens in a way that's visible as a one-time act. The ongoing action that shows that you've been united with Christ by baptism is the way that you're living your life. So you ought to be able to look at a person's way of life, what they do with their body, and you should be able to tell that they are a Christian by the way that they are living their life. It ought to be distinctive and different. So I would suggest, again, you look for a way to think about the way in which in our culture we might mark out that we're Maori. We do things like being Maori doesn't come from those outward symbols. You are Maori by your whakapapa, but you might well signal it in particular ways by your use of the reo Māori. You might have a taonga that you're wearing. There are some things you can do to signal out there. And so just thinking about the difference between baptism, which is the one-off thing, that's like your whakapapa, that never changes. And then the way you're living your life might be a way of trying to get this across to people, that this is almost like the uniform that a Christian wears, is that what they do with their body is different. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.